Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the first afternoon panel on language and religion. My name is Kathy Wanner. I'm a professor at Penn State University. I'm also an anthropologist who's conducted research on the politics of religion for about 35 years now. I'm grateful to Andrea for the invitation to be here, to introduce Oxana, and to offer a few questions based on the comments that she'll deliver to you today. I think Oxana in many ways needs no introduction, but I'll give her one anyway. She's the president of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. She's also the vice president of the Association for the Study of Nationalities. She's an associate professor of political science at neighboring Tufts University, and she's the author of 2 books, most recently of which, together with Maria Popova, is Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, and Diverging States. Those of us who study religion are very, very pleased she's turned her keen eye towards analyzing the politics of religion in Ukraine. So please join me in welcoming Oxana.
Thank you very much, Cassie, for the generous introduction. Thank you all for inviting me to participate. 20 minutes is not much time to cover language and religion, both big topics, but I will try to do my best, and I speak fast, so that may come as an advantage. So I'm going to focus my remarks around 3 parts. I want to talk first about significant and rapid turn away from Russia, we can put it in quotation marks, that has taken place in Ukraine. The earlier panel has been alluding it, in attitudes, in particular after the full-scale invasion, and it is evident in both the questions of language and religion. I'll show a few illustrative slides on those ones in particular in a moment. Then I will try to add a little bit more nuance, because this overall picture that there is this increase pro-Ukrainian, we can say broadly speaking, attitudes, which manifest themselves in reduction in the use of Russia, the turn away from the church that's perceived to be still affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church. But depending how the question is asked, depending kind of what methodology is used, the picture could be somewhat more nuanced, even though this general trend still holds. And then for the second part of my remarks, I want to focus on the government policies, because the dilemmas that the government faced and continues to face, and this is something that I would argue we can expect to remain for the foreseeable future, because both language and religion has been securitized in Ukraine. And this securitization of these issues and the policies that were adopted to reduce the threat, arguably the security threat that Russification and this Russia-affiliated, allegedly church poses for the state, have met with criticism, especially internationally, with the arguments being that certain minority standard rights are being violated by these laws and policies. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then we can have time for discussion, hopefully. So this slide just illustrates, this will be all known to all of you. There has been strengthening of Ukrainian civic identity in Ukraine, manifested by many, many surveys. This is an example of people choosing citizen of Ukraine as their primary identification. There also has been an increase in Ukrainian ethno-national identification. So this is a survey that shows people are answering the question, what is your nationality, which is understood kind of more as ethnic identity. And we see this great increase in the number of people who think of themselves as Ukrainian, and the decrease in the number of people who think of themselves as Russian. So there is this kind of fusion of political and ethnic identity. Volodymyr Kulik has a lot of interesting research on that, and has provocatively argued in a recent article that Ukraine actually stopped being a multi-ethnic country because of these kinds of trends. And these trends are also evident in the sphere of language. So if we look, for example, in this chart, so 2 things I want to emphasize here. So first of all, this association of support for Ukrainian as one's native language, which is really more kind of indication of one's ethno-political identity, has been on the rise for some time. But what really changes with the full-scale invasion is also beginning greater change in linguistic practice and the shift away towards greater use of Ukrainian, because the actual linguistic practice has not changed that much. There has been some movement, but not really dramatically, but we really see quite substantial change since the full-scale invasion. So broadly speaking, again, different surveys have slightly different numbers, but some 30% of the population report having switched to using Ukrainian more in different facets of their lives, from school and employment, where it is actually the highest, to family life, where the shift is a little bit lower, but also evident, and friends, everyday life, and so forth. So there is, that's definitely happening. What is a little bit less known, that this shift, I mean, it is known for experts, but maybe less so for the overall kind of broader public, that the shift has been particularly consequential in the south and east of Ukraine. And this is important because, of course, these areas have historically been more Russian-speaking, and Russian is still, very widely used there. But this shift in the reported greater use of Ukrainian has really affected significantly the south and the east of the country in particular, right? So this is also, I don't really have time to go into it, but it's interesting thing to consider how meaningful is the whole Russian-speaking designation in Ukraine. Like, who is a Russian speaker? What does it even mean? Is it really still a meaningful category? Some people argue not so, and in fact, Ukrainian Constitutional Court in a ruling from a few years ago called this expression from the sphere of quote-unquote political rhetoric. So that's also something might be interesting to discuss. Now, we see similar process with regard to religion. As you might know, in late 2018, early 2019, among the three competing Orthodox churches in Ukraine, that has been the case since 91, two of them, with just a few bishops from the Russia-affiliated Ukrainian Orthodox Church, joined together and formed this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I know it's confusing, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but they are different churches. And there has been this greater identification of the population with the OCU that is perceived, as an independent from Moscow church, and reduction of the association self-reported identification with the church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that allegedly still remains tied to Russian Orthodox Church. Now, so this trend is, and another, I think, important trend that the slide shows is that this category that has been very prevalent in Ukraine, this kind of more hybrid identity, people, and Cassie had done a lot of work on this, people who say that they're simply Orthodox, they're just Orthodox, they don't affiliate with any church, has declined as well. And that, again, might be interpreted as with the full-scale invasion and the war, there is less space for kind of ambiguous and fluid identities, but they by no means have disappeared, but arguably have lessened. So all of this is to say that this dynamics, I think, clearly relates to the war, and I think it also importantly shows that people's both linguistic choices and religious kind of affiliation can be driven by their political attitudes. So traditionally, scholarship have thought that sort of one's linguistic and or religious identities and practices would determine or causal to one's political affiliation, but I think as preferences, and I think in Ukraine we see an illustration of the opposite, of people who reject the Russian invasion, who, and we have both qualitative and quantitative evidence, people saying they switched to Ukrainian, right, or left the Russia-affiliated church because of their rejection of, Russian invasion, Russian goals against Ukraine, and so forth. So that's also interesting to keep in mind. Now, I said I want to complicate, this is another, the increase in the number of people who want to see a nationally oriented church. We can come back to that because that's not to be confused with support for state church, which still remains a minority position. Now, but if we want to kind of complicate the picture a little bit, so and here is, I think in my summary of my comments that was circulated before the presentation for the participants, I sort of maybe somewhat provocatively quoted, I think it's Lenin once said this expression that you have 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. And in some kind of, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think the process could be this both linguistic and religious reunification, we shouldn't over-essentialize it. And there is still quite a lot of complexity and dynamism, and maybe in some ways kind of the plateauing of some of these transformations that started in 2022. So here, for example, if we look at the switching of the parishes that have been switching from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, you see kind of it peaking at the time the church first forms in late 2018, early 2019. And then again peaking after the full-scale invasion, and then sort of slowing down over time, right? So that's kind of the dynamic, the dynamic, I think I'm going the wrong way, there, right? Also, depending how the question is asked is very important, because different polls might show different extent of public affiliation with these competing churches, depending if Moscow Patriarchy designation is or is not used in the title, right? And also if people are explicitly given the simply Orthodox option to identify, or if they have to self-select it themselves. And here, again, just to illustrate, Kyiv International Institute of Sociology did this sort of experiment, but they asked the same question in like 5 different ways. Right, and 4 different ways, and you can see, right, how you get quite different number of both people considering themselves simply Orthodox and affiliation with these different churches. So again, kind of overall trend of away from Moscow patriarchy is there, but the extent of it and what it means, I think, could be debated depending how the question is asked. Now, and of course, this is another illustration I want to show that actually created a bit of a kind of scandal in Ukraine when this data was first released in 2023-24, because this is the data was a survey of the school children. And as you see, between 22-23 school year to 23-24 school year, we actually see increase in the use of Russian among school children, and then it sort of reverts, back in 2024-25. And of course, if we look at the slide on the language use here, we still see substantial part of the population in 2005 still, obviously uses Russian in various ways. All right. So in other words, kind of this trajectory, away from Russian, from all things Russia, they're certainly there, but they may have plateaued, at least for now, right? And then sort of the question becomes, what does it mean, right? Like, what do you make? And there are debates in society, like, what does it mean? Can one, for example, continue to just function in Russian and not say, potentially refuse to speak in Ukrainian in public domain? Like, does it make one less Ukrainian? Can you go to the quote-unquote Russian church and, be supportive, be considered fully Ukrainian? So all these things are debated in society, and they also, this brings me to the third point I want to talk about, the question of government policies. So as I said, both religion and language have been securitized in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. In political science, there is this concept of ontological security, meaning that security is not just sort of physical and material, but it could also be spiritual. And in fact, the term spiritual independence has been used in Ukraine in justification of policies to limit the influence of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I'll talk about it in a second. So essentially, because Russia has instrumentalized, as we know, the so-called protection, as they put it, of Russian speakers, and they supposedly cast themselves as defenders of what they call canonical church. It is, of course, cynical beyond belief, given the total suppression of both linguistic and religious rights under occupation, but still this kind of narrative that, this is what Russia is fighting. The justification for the war leads to kind of counter-reaction in Ukraine, where counting Russification and reducing the influence of Russian church is seen as a matter of national security. Ukrainian government uses terms such as language is the basis of national identity, key element of societal consolidation. It safeguards distinct nation, which in turn underpins distinct state. And similar arguments are made on the religions front, because Russian Orthodox Church is propagating this Ruski Mir narrative, and kind of the cornerstone of it is this conception of supposedly divinely preordained Holy Rus, the unity of Russia and Ukraine in this, Holy Rus, and that's what we are defending and fighting for in the war. And of course, there is no space for either distinct Ukrainian political identity or distinct political statehood. So again, this kind of messaging is seen as really damaging and threatening to national security. And then its correspondence with the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe in particular, Ukrainian government said that legislation is dictated that limits these, I'll talk about legislation in a second, is dictated, quote unquote, by urgent national security considerations, taking into account hybrid warfare, instrumentalization of ethnic, linguistic, and religious issue by Russia to justify armed aggression against Ukraine and undermine internal political stability of Ukrainian society. So what has the state had actually done? So since 2002, various laws have been adopted in Ukraine. So for example, on the language front, there has been a new law on national minorities adopted in 23, and also revisions to laws on education, media, and so forth. And Ukraine now draws a distinction between what they call the EU languages and the language of the aggressor state. So in other words, now Russian language is defined as, because it's a state official language of a state that is recognized by the Ukrainian parliament as have committed as an aggressor and occupying state. There are different treatments in this various legislation. The most recent of it is, in fact, new translation of the Council of Europe Convention on Minority Languages, regional and minority languages, when Russian is no longer part of this protected list of languages, and as I said, various laws on minorities, education, and so forth. So essentially, there is different treatment in legislation of Russian language as opposed to languages of the EU countries. Now, these policies have broad societal support, because if we actually look at in what people actually prefer. So you can see, for example, on the question what should be the state policy towards Russian language, the option that Russian should be official language, you have some sort of official status, has really declined since the full-scale invasion, and also even the idea that Russian should be taught in schools similarly, or more than foreign languages, is also declining support. There are still some people who support it, but they are a minority in that sense. And the same goes for the policies towards the church. So there is a law in Ukraine that was passed in 2024 that essentially says Ukrainian religious institutions, A, has to sever links with Russian Orthodox Church, which is now banned in Ukraine, and B, also cannot propagate Ruski Mir. And this law has been broadly supported. Again, there is some variation depending how the title of the church is used. But sort of domestically, as I'm saying, it's not that controversial. But internationally, it has been quite controversial, because if we look at the norms on minority rights in general, and especially religious freedom norms in particular, that religious freedom norm is pretty absolute. So essentially, freedom of religion is defined as a non-derogable right, meaning even for national security reasons, governments are not allowed to limit it. This is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, the debate in Ukraine is this really about religion as in faith, or is this really about institution and ideology, right? So the position of the Ukrainian government is that they're not, in fact, limiting faith and religion. Subordination to Moscow Patriarchy is not part of the Orthodox Church, sort of Orthodox canons. And all they're asking from religious institutions is to sever links with the Russian Orthodox Church and not propagate Ruski Mir ideology. This does not infringe on the freedom of religion. Not everybody agrees. So there is very active kind of back and forth between Ukrainian government and international critics on that issue, right? And on language, it's a little bit, I want to say better, somewhat easier for Ukrainian government, because there is no absolute norm like on religious freedom, and states can limit, various rights, including linguistic rights, under national security considerations, but the limits still have to be, according to international law, proportionate and non-discriminatory and legitimate. But what it means is, again, is kind of open to debate. And if you look at these exchanges between the Ukrainian Authority and various rights watchdogs, in particular the Venice Commission, that they Commission acknowledges that, yes, Ukraine faces this unique situation in the context of the Russian war. There is legacy of Russification. There is instrumentalization of language issue by Russia. So yes, there could be different treatment. Not all difference in treatment is considered discrimination, but they cannot be overly long. They, for example, have to end with the martial law. Some Ukrainian legislation and draft legislation wants to extend this potentially for years, right? So there is kind of a lot of debate over this. And I just want to say that, having looked at it in some detail, especially on the religions front, I think the situation in Ukraine is actually not that dissimilar with what happens in Western Europe, because there often also governments come under criticism of human rights watchdogs, in particular for various policies limiting quote-unquote extremism, which is considered disproportionate towards affecting Muslim population. And then there is this kind of legal back and forth, and the courts get involved, and usually policy modifications result, as opposed to kind of some sort of whole-scale cancellation of policy. And that's what we see in Ukraine. So the case against the Orthodox Church is pending in the court. There is a lot of kind of legal back and forth. Ukraine has changed certain provisions of both of its minorities and education law in response to the criticism of the human rights groups in Europe. So I should be ending here, because we're getting out of time. But I just want to sort of say that there are these kind of two questions are there. So one is about this criticism of international actors, and the question is, to my mind at least, does Ukrainian case, is it sufficiently unique, right? And should we, in fact, in good faith, say that kind of blanket application of abstract principles, maybe that's not the way to go? And it seems like there is a realization of this for the language part, less so for the religion part. But also important question, what is likely to be the effectiveness of these measures, right? So if the goal is to increase state security, so forth, critics say that, in fact, limiting, be it linguistic rights or any other minority right, in fact, can create the opposite effect. It can anger the minorities. They can, the church can go underground. There's going to be more resentment of the state and so forth. So in other words, the desired goal of increased security would not be achieved. But I think that's also a question that we can debate. So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Oksana. What I thought I would do is pose 4 questions based on the comments you just offered. The first on language, just because I do think that is a far more sort of an easier domain. Although, of course, I think crises could be provoked and tensions can be manufactured. I think after 35 years or so of ethnographic research, I think I can say that Ukrainians are at a bare bones minimum, at least passively bilingual. And even before the invasion, I think there was a pretty entrenched practice of what anthropologists call non-reciprocal bilingualism, where everyone just spoke whatever their language of preference was. And I think that has sort of morphed into, as you began to show in some of your surveys, but I think what people on the ground doing ethnographic research would say is sort of Ukrainian in public and Russian in private, and even sometimes not even that. So I guess I would ask you whether you think really a language problem really is there to be made, or whether there inherently is a language problem. I think the situation in religion is far more complex. And so my first question there concerning religion has to do with external actors, and the import of external actors really being the engines that are driving politics and the policies of religion in Ukraine. By what I mean by that is, of course, the Moscow Patriarch, for starters. We can debate what kind of influence and impact the Moscow Patriarchate might have on religious life in Ukraine, and indeed many do. But because there is this perception at a bare bones minimum that there is some involvement, that begets the involvement of the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople or Istanbul. And of course, this plays out most acutely in Europe when it comes to the communities that are formed in Europe to serve the 12 or so million refugees from Ukraine. We also see, for example, the Vatican, whether we're talking about Pope Francis and his early attempts to broker a peace accord between the two, or Pope Leo, who increasingly has very pronounced views on war and on peace. I would also mention the evangelical Protestants from Ukraine, who have marshaled issues of freedom of religion and belief and in fact have approached Mike Johnson successfully and argued that there is tremendous religious repression in the occupied territories, and in fact hired lobbyists to make that case, which then prompted the Russian Orthodox Church to hire its own lobbyists to make the opposing case that really no, the repression is in the government-controlled areas towards the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. In short, I mean, there are many, many possible examples one could give, but in short, what I want to ask is, are these external actors really the ones now driving the policies towards religion in Ukraine, far more so than Ukrainians themselves? I don't mean to suggest that Ukrainians are negligible in this process, and my second question addresses then the issue of those religious policies that have been adopted and what perhaps one of the unintended effects of those policies have been. And this goes to the heart of whether, in fact, we have, if you will, a religious proxy war. That is to say, the war plays out on the level of religious institutions. Religious lawfare is the term that some have used to describe some of the policies that have been implemented. You yourself have written a lot about the transitions, but there's also the issue of trying to force the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to include the name of Russia or Moscow, or in some way signal that it is inherently connected to the Russian Orthodox Church in its very name. And of course, all of that has really intensified with attempts to try to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So I would ask then, to what extent do you think, in fact, then these religious policies ultimately, unfortunately, serve to make a mockery of the rule of law, because they either beget all kinds of criticism from human rights and other international legal organizations, or also because they are, at best, either excruciatingly difficult to implement or perhaps not even possible to implement, let alone under conditions of war. And the last question I would offer, you mentioned towards the end of your presentation, what effect, should the ban be successful and implemented, what effect that might have on those who might subscribe to an affiliation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? And I think that's really worth considering, and especially worth considering that the group that calls themselves Prosto Pravoslavny, or just Orthodox, those who refuse to claim allegiance to one or the other, already as the end of last year has already now the single, when that is included in an option. You're very right to point out that responses vary with tremendous divergence when depending on how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is called, and most importantly, I would say, when there is the option to just declare oneself Prosto Pravoslavny. And you're right, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology just 2 days ago released a poll, and when they include Prosto Pravoslavny, of the 2/3 Orthodox in Ukraine, 56% claim that they are Prosto Pravoslavny. They're just Orthodox. They do not choose Epifanio or Onufri. And so perhaps this is really the group that we should focus on. How might they, as, if you will, swing voters, how might they be affected by a banning, given that there is this pronounced history of catacomb churches and religious groups in Ukraine? And by and large, how, if we take the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as an example, that generally has given those churches a certain kind of moral and national credibility. And so one wonders then what ultimately the effect of a ban would be for those two groups, which are very significant in Ukraine today. So I'll end there. Thank you.